everyone. Good morning. Welcome. Question for you today on the whiteboard. If you were going to have like a warning label that advertised to people something about you in advance, what would your warning label be? For example, being a history teacher, I appreciate the one here on the whiteboard because definitely have done that on more than one occasion where someone made a silly or inaccurate comment about a history topic, and I cannot help but step in and educate or clarify. I like it, Rissa. Giving people a heads up about the house cat. Definitely, some cats can be devious. No doubt about it. Anyone else able to come up with something that would potentially be your warning sign to give other people a heads up about something related to you? I like it, Hunter. Say when my wife's family comes to visit, our house ends up kind of becoming the same way because they bring all of their dogs with them. When they came down for the eclipse, I think we had 8 dogs in the house, which we by no means have a large house. So that was a lot of dogs. Or yeah, a fragile warning. Hey, give people a heads up on that right now. Whew, 16 dogs. That is impressive. Good. Anyone else? Feel free to share an answer in the chat, but we'll get to the vocab slide here so people can start jotting that down. While you are doing so, forgot to make a correction here on this slide. Don't worry, your family history project is not due yet. I forgot to update this slide for this semester. It's due on Sunday, but definitely do want to make sure you get that turned in because that is a big assignment. It's worth a decent chunk of points. You don't really want to be stuck with a 0 in the grade book for it. That's it's gonna unfortunately have a pretty negative impact on your grade. And as a reminder, U.S. history is a graduation requirement, so we definitely want to make sure everyone passes this class so that you get one step closer to graduating high school. Obviously, if you have any concerns or feel like you need any help with that, let me know. Because again, we are quickly approaching the end of the school year. May 17th is the last day to turn in any missing work from units 5 and 6, which is not that far away. We basically got 3 weeks left to go. Oh, an awesome error. Congratulations on that. And good, Cole. Glad to hear you got it done. I look forward to reading them. All right, give me one moment here to send out the email to those who are running late at this point. And then we will get going. All right. So we kind of have 2 main topics here for today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the 2000 presidential election because some craziness kind of happens there. Um, and then we will start getting into the topic of terrorism, um, leading up to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and kind of how that shaped the country. So, from over the course of the 90s, the president was primarily Bill Clinton, um, who had his fair share of controversies. We talked about some of them the other day. Challenges with immigration, challenges with how to handle homosexuals in the military. Ultimately, he will get impeached um, as a result of lying about having an affair while president, but does not get removed as president, um, and overall ends as a very popular president, in part because the economy was doing so well over the course of the 90s. And I think, as I mentioned the other day, that tends to be the primary method of how voters evaluate presidents. If the economy was doing well, must have meant that the president was doing a good job. If the economy is doing poorly, must mean we have a bad president. Reality is more complicated than that. Presidents can have some impact on the economy, uh, but they also do a lot of work outside of that. But because the economy was doing so well in the 90s, in large part due to the rise of the internet and all of the economic activity that was coming about with the rise of the internet, you think about online stores and businesses, that were starting to rise during that time period, eBay, Amazon, stuff like that. Democrats were hopeful that they would be able to win the 2000 presidential election, ultimately nominating Bill Clinton's vice president, Al Gore. On the flip side, the Republicans nominate George W. Bush, who is actually the son of George H.W. Bush, who was president in the late 80s, early 90s. And so, as you can see here, looking at the election map here, it ends up being an incredibly close election, both in terms of the popular vote and the division of the Electoral College. And Christopher, thanks for letting me know. Glad you can make it. To the point that on election night, it was not immediately clear who won the election. And really, it's all going to come down to Florida. Florida ended up being an incredibly close election. And ultimately, whoever ends up winning the state of Florida, that would give them the electoral vote number to win the presidency. If Bush wins Florida, it gets him just above the 270 mark that he needs. If Gore ends up winning Florida, it would put him well above the 270. And so things go back and forth. Gore won Florida. No, Bush won Florida. Ultimately, Bush is declared the initial winner of Florida. But because it's such a close vote, Florida begins what's called the recount process of going back through all of the votes, to kind of double check their work and make sure all the votes were counted correctly. Well, that quickly becomes challenging because in Florida that year, in some parts of the state, they used a punch-out ballot where voters had to punch out marks on the ballot to cast their vote. And so that created all this controversy of, well, what if the punch out is not fully punched out? Do we count that as a vote or not? and that may seem like something you're like, well, that seems really straightforward, but sometimes it wasn't. You're like, well, what if it's like partially punched out? What if there's just kind of a corner that's punched out? What if there's just an indent? Um, do we count that as assuming that person meant to vote for that person and just didn't punch it all the way out? Or were they starting to cast a vote and then they changed their mind and pulled back, the marker at the last minute? So it created all this controversy. But as the recount was being conducted, the state of Florida was finding additional votes for Al Gore that were missed the first time. And it was starting to look like that if the recount was finished completely, perhaps Al Gore might be declared the winner of Florida. And so the Bush campaign sued and took the issue to the Supreme Court to intervene. Because if ultimately Gore is declared the winner of Florida, Gore becomes the next president of the United States. And so ultimately the Supreme Court steps in and basically makes a ruling that says Florida is not being consistent in how it's going about conducting the recount, and there's not going to be enough time for Florida to figure it out before the election has to be certified in December. So the Supreme Court basically ruled that Florida had to stop its recount and that Bush be declared the winner of Florida, and as a result, become the next president of the United States. This is known as the Supreme Court case of Bush v. Gore, where ultimately the Supreme Court ruled in Bush's favor, that the recount should stop, and that Bush would ultimately, as a result of that ruling, be the next president of the United States. Now, if you had to take a guess, how might some people react to the Supreme Court's decision here? Yeah, for some Americans, typically those who voted for Al Gore, they were pretty upset. They felt like the Supreme Court was stepping in and basically deciding the election of who the next president was going to be, with some feeling like the Supreme Court stole the election from Al Gore and the Democrats, especially because overall, Al Gore won more votes across the United States. But remember, for presidential elections, it's not about who gets the most votes overall. It's who wins the right combination of states to get a majority of the Electoral College votes, which ultimately Bush did by winning Florida. On the other hand, and hey there, Christina, glad you can make it. You'll probably want to check out the recording later today to catch the first part of class. On the other hand, for those who voted for George Bush, how might they feel about the Supreme Court's decision here? Yeah, they're probably more likely to be supportive because they're like, okay, good. Yeah, I wanted Bush to win. He was originally declared the winner of Florida. Florida really wasn't being consistent on how it was conducting the recount in the first place. So, that makes sense to me that Bush should just be, declared the winner of the presidential election. So it ended up being a very controversial decision in the sense that, the country was very divided about, did the Supreme Court do the right thing here or not? Should they have gotten involved in stopping the recount or not? And so the Bush v. Gore ends up being significant, one, because it determines who the next president of the United States is going to be for the next 8 years, including, who's going to be president once 9/11 happens. That's going to be significant. But two, it also ends up being a major step in the growing controversy surrounding the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, the initial vision was that the Supreme Court wouldn't be viewed as being political, that it should be viewed as really just a group of referees that kind of call, um, you know, balls and strikes. I guess umpire is what I'm going for here. Then, um, based on what does the Constitution say? But of course, in reality, the Supreme Court has always been political. Um, they get nominated by presidents and approved by Congress, who are political entities. And ultimately, the rulings they make are based on their political interpretations of the Constitution and the law. Um, and so that's kind of the reality we are in today, where people increasingly view the Supreme Court as being liberal or conservative. Currently we have a very conservative Supreme Court, in part because Donald Trump, got to nominate 3 judges to the Supreme Court. But especially in the aftermath of things like the Dobbs decision, which removed a woman's constitutional right to abortion. Americans increasingly view the Supreme Court as being a political force that can politically lean one way or another. It also created kind of a rough start for the Bush presidency because you had a large number of Americans who kind of felt like maybe Bush shouldn't be the president in the first place. That he won the presidency because the Supreme Court stepped in and gave it to him. So that's kind of a rough way to start your presidency. However, a lot of that's going to kind of be displaced once 9/11 happens, the following year. But before we start getting into 9/11 and terrorism, there are some significant things that happen under the Bush presidency before that. One is on the topic of climate change. That was starting to become a growing topic of conversation in American politics by 2000. That was actually one of the things Al Gore ran on, that he thought climate change was a very serious issue and that the country should be doing more early to prepare for climate change or to try to stop climate change. Bush, on the other hand, did not view it as being a serious issue that required serious action. So the chart that you see here on the whiteboard is looking at data from 2013. So obviously a little bit later than 2000, but patterns would largely be the same. So we have 2 pie charts. One pie chart is looking at what do climate scientists have to say about is climate change happening and human caused? And then we have a second pie chart of what do the American people on average think about that? So I'll bring up the polling tools here in just a second. But which of the following conclusions regarding climate change could be made based on the data displayed in the charts from 2013? Would it be A, Americans as a whole mirror the views of the scientific community on climate change? B, there is a large debate within the scientific community regarding climate change? C, a majority of Americans disagree with the scientific community on the topic of climate change? Or D, most Americans get their information on climate change from the internet? Which of those conclusions would be backed up or supported by the data on the whiteboard here? Go ahead and use the polling tools to make your selection. And thank you for those of you who've responded already. Um, if you haven't made a selection, go ahead and take an educated guess at this point. As always, there's not a penalty for getting things wrong, but lets me kind of see what you're thinking. Um, in addition to that, if I don't get a response from you, I kind of have to assume you're not really here attending class right now. So let's see here. I'm still looking for a response from, excuse me, Emma, David, Jacob, Thamarius, Riley, Trey, Abby, Jayla, Samantha, Kaya, Christina, Christopher. Good, good. Got some more responses coming in. All right. So, a majority of us went with C, and you would be correct. Let's go through these real fast. Good. Number one, no one picked D. Because while D is likely to be an accurate statement, nothing in this chart actually tells us that. This isn't giving us any data on where people get their information from. So while D may be a true statement, we don't have anything here on the whiteboard to back that up. So, that's why D can be eliminated. So to evaluate A, we would need to compare the two charts. So as a starting point, what percent of climate scientists say that, yes, climate change is happening and it is human caused? According to the chart, what percent of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening and it is caused by humans? Excellent, Jimmy. Yeah, 97%, because we would look under here for climate scientists, and then we would look at yes, and we can see that we have 97% there. So 97% of all climate scientists agree climate change is happening, it's caused by humans. Going over to the American public, what percent of the American public said yes, climate change is happening and human caused back in 2013? Good, Kaylee. Yeah, 41%. So, and Mira as well. So what would you guys say? Are the numbers 97% and 41% mirroring one another? Are those two pretty close to one another? Yeah, I'd agree. No, that's there's a pretty big distance between like 97% and 41%. So clearly there's a disagreement there between what climate scientists are concluding and what the American public are saying. So that's why we can eliminate A. So then B is saying there's a large debate within the scientific community. Now, we already identified that 97% of scientists said yes, climate change is happening in human caused. So would you say that there's a big divide within a group if 97% of them picked one response? Right. Again, no. If 97% of a group is on the same page, that is not a large debate. There's a pretty clear consensus there at that point. So that's why we can eliminate A and B. And so C would ultimately be the right answer, because you do have the scientific community, on one hand, saying, hey, based on our expertise, based on what we've studied, climate change is definitely happening and human beings are contributing to it. But you only have 41% of the American people as a whole agreeing with that conclusion, um, with the majority of Americans either disagreeing with that conclusion or saying, I don't know. I'm not sure. So, especially all the way back in 2000, 2001, um, even more Americans disagreed with the conclusion that climate change was a serious issue. And so while the planet as a whole was starting to pay more attention to climate change, under the Bush administration, that is not going to be a priority. There, for example, becomes an international agreement known as the Kyoto Protocols, which would have been countries of the world agreeing all the way back in 2001 to more aggressively try to respond to climate change. But the Bush administration refuses to go along with that. And as a result, that whole agreement kind of falls apart, because for a lot of countries, their thought process was, well, if America's not going to make changes to try to adjust climate change, then neither are we. You also have the Bush administration further weaken the power of the Environmental Protection Agency. In addition to that, over the past couple of years, for the first time in a long while, the US government was running a surplus, meaning the government had money left over at the end of the year. It was not spending more than it collected in taxes, which I think was something that hadn't happened since the early 1960s, if I remember correctly. So when Bush came into office, his argument was, well, that must mean that government is collecting too much in taxes. And so you have the passage of the largest tax cuts in American history, which was exciting for a lot of Americans who now were going to pay less in taxes. But what would that ultimately do to the government's budget if you dramatically cut taxes? Yeah, it's going to significantly reduce the amount of money coming into the government to spend on things. Yet you don't really have cuts to government spending. And so as a result, we once again see the government start to operate on a deficit during the Bush administration. The years in blue, those would be the Clinton years, and you can see that we have a surplus. Government has money left over that it could potentially use to pay off its debt or things like that. But after the Bush tax cuts, we once again see the government operating on a deficit, government spending more money than it collects. And that's only going to get worse after 9/11. And you have the government significantly increase its military spending. So that's kind of a rough combination of your increasing military spending while lowering taxes. That really starts to put the government in debt once again. And that's basically been the reality for the US government ever since. This is the last year that the government had a surplus. It's 2001. The Bush administration also makes big changes to education in the United States with the passage of No Child Left Behind. One of the biggest changes is tying school funding to how schools perform on standardized testing. And so while standardized testing existed prior to No Child Left Behind, I, for example, remember doing state testing in elementary school in the 90s. Um, this is really when state testing kind of became this like big deal for schools. It put a lot of pressure on schools to do well on state testing, because if they didn't, they potentially lost funding. Some argued that that would be a strong motivator for schools to work harder. Others argued that it put all of the attention on education on the test and just trying to make sure students do well on that test at the expense of potentially other elements of education. Um, so these early acts were decisions that were largely popular among conservative Republicans and unpopular among liberal Democrats. And so the Bush presidency began with the country being very divided on things. But then on September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks will happen. And basically everything is going to change overnight. Bush is going to go from being a fairly controversial president with basically a 50% approval rating up to a 90% approval rating. So with that, let's start getting into the topic of terrorism. First off, a definition. Terrorism can be defined as the planned use of violence to strike fear into people or governments to obtain political goals. It is typically a tactic used by extremist groups who believe in using extreme methods to try to achieve their goals, whatever that may be. And while 9/11 is going to be the most dramatic act of terrorism in US history, it is not something brand new to the United States. To a certain extent, terrorism can kind of be a subjective label. If we, for example, go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, from the British point of view, they might have called the Boston Tea Party an act of terrorism, because ultimately acts of violence were committed at the Boston Tea Party for a political purpose. But even among Americans of this era, you had previous experiences with terrorism. For example, in the 1970s, you had a wave of plane hijackings where terrorists would take over an airplane as part of a political goal. The difference back then is that when terrorists hijacked a plane, they would land the plane and hold the passengers hostage until their demands were met, whatever they may be. We also see a rise of domestic terrorism in the United States, of white right-wing radicals. For example, you have the bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995 that ultimately killed 168 Americans. That was carried out by a young man who had come to the conclusion that the US government was the enemy of the United States, and believed that violence had to be used to send a message to the government. Or in 1996, when the United States hosts the Olympic Games in Atlanta, you have a man who bombs a part of the Olympic facility um, as a form of protest against abortions being carried out in the United States. Um, because as we've previously talked about, with all of the social changes in the 60s and the 70s, um, you had a conservative counter reaction against that. You also had this growing anti-government voice that especially was becoming popular on talk radio shows, um, hammering this message to listeners that the government was the enemy, the government was the threat. The government is going to take away your freedom and independence, and that ultimately radicalized some people to come to the conclusion that they needed to use violence to send a political message. At the same time, we also see the growing use of terrorism among Islamic fundamentalist groups in the Middle East. The most significant of which is going to be the organization known as Al Qaeda, as that will be the organization responsible for carrying out the 9/11 terrorist attacks. As an Islamic fundamentalist group, it would be a religiously conservative movement that believed that a strict interpretation of Islam should be used as the basis for governing society, and was led by this man, Osama bin Laden, who actually in the 1980s worked with the United States, because in the 1980s, Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviet Union. And America's attitude at the time was, well, if these are people who are willing to fight back against the Soviet Union, we want to help them out. And so the United States provided them with weapons and supplies in their fight against the Soviet Union. But the issue there was that bin Laden was not just against the Soviet Union, he was against any country that he felt was trying to push its way into the Middle East. And so he also wasn't a fan of the United States, because the United States also had a history of interfering in Middle Eastern countries, as we've previously talked about with Iran. And so after the fall of the Soviet Union, Al Qaeda increasingly focused on pushing back against the United States, trying to send a message to the United States to get out of Middle Eastern affairs. And so, for example, in 1998, Al Qaeda bombs 2 US embassies in Africa. And then in 2000, they conducted a suicide bombing against a US naval ship that was stationed in the waters of the Middle East, attacking the USS Cole, which is what you see here. And so Al Qaeda was on the government's radar. Osama bin Laden had been identified as being a threat. But the vast majority of people could not fathom or predict Al Qaeda doing something as extreme as 9/11. When ultimately Al Qaeda operatives hijack and take control of 4 airplanes, 2 of which get flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, which had been kind of one of the defining landmarks of New York City. If you watch like any older movies that were filmed in the 80s or the 90s in New York City, like you're going to see the Twin Towers at one point or another in that movie. But ultimately, you had a lot of banks and businesses that had offices in the Twin Towers. And so, in many ways, the Twin Towers kind of represented America's financial strength. Um, you also have a plane that gets flown into the Pentagon, which is essentially America's military headquarters. Um, and so that was an attack, kind of representing going after America's military strength. Um, Luckily, the section of the Pentagon that the plane is rammed into was being renovated, and so was largely empty. So thankfully, casualties are comparatively low compared to what we see on the attacks on the Twin Towers. There was also a fourth plane that was hijacked, Flight 93, that likely its target was the White House, to hit America's kind of political strength. Um, but um, after the planes were flown into the Twin Towers, passengers on Flight 93, were getting that information and, recognized what was in store for them. And so a group of passengers fought against the hijackers to try to regain control of the plane. Um, in that scuffle, tragically, the plane crash lands in Pennsylvania, but luckily crash lands into an open field. Um, and so those everyday people, ultimately, saved lives fighting back against the hijackers and preventing Al Qaeda from carrying out its planned mission there. And so that's what you can see here is Flight 93 ultimately crash landing in Pennsylvania. Um, that's that was ultimately an incredibly surreal and difficult day for everyone who was alive at that time. Um, as you've been doing your family history projects, I'm sure many of you have had family members that was kind of the historical event they talked about. It's kind of one of those events that uh, everyone remembers, like what they were doing that day when they first found out about the attacks. Um, I would have been in middle school at the time, and our school held off on telling us because we were actually doing state testing that very day. And the school did not want to disrupt state testing. And so they waited until everyone was done with state testing for that day to get on the intercoms and let us know about the 9/11 attacks. And then, the rest of the day, just every teacher had the news turned on and, everyone just kind of sat there and, watched the news. And then, we all went home to our families, and our parents had the news on the TV, and then we spent that entire evening just sitting there watching the news. Um, because ultimately this was the most serious attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor. And as we've previously talked about, um, America has been very fortunate that we have rarely been attacked within our own borders. America's been involved in a lot of wars, but the majority of those wars have been fought somewhere else. So it's rarely ever American civilians that are killed. It's rarely ever our cities that get destroyed. And so if you can try to put yourself in the shoes of people back then, um, how might 9/11 impact people's thinking after this day? How might it possibly change how people act or think? Definitely Mason. You're absolutely right. There was a lot of fear among Americans towards flying um, in the weeks and months after 9/11. Um, it dramatically negatively impacted trade and tourism in the United States because for a long time, a lot of people just they didn't want to fly, they didn't want to get on planes, um, which ultimately is kind of one of the purposes of terrorism. It's trying to create a sense of fear among people, to change their behavior, to change how they do things. Um, and understandably, a lot of people were afraid. Um, because in many ways, it kind of shattered American sense of safety within their own country. Um, which was something that a lot of Americans really hadn't ever experienced before. Because again, normally when America gets involved in a war, it's fought somewhere else on the planet. So that was something that was really hard for Americans to process. This feeling of no longer feeling safe within our own country. Um, and so, when the country goes through a crisis like this, the country often looks to the president, for guidance, for leadership. Um, and in that moment of crisis and tragedy for the United States, uh, President Bush comes out strong. He goes to the wreckage in New York City. Um, there's a famous moment where he's trying to talk to the recovery workers there on a megaphone, and it's malfunctioning and not working right. And so someone in the crowd shouts out to the president, "We can't hear you." And Bush responds by saying, "But I can hear you." And then says something like, and soon the whole world will hear you. And that was kind of this like rallying moment of, you know, America's going to come back from this. Um, we're going to push back against this. We're not just going to, you know, accept this and lie down. Um, he then follows that up with a speech on September 16th, which is just, 5 days after the attack, outlining a game plan for what becomes known as a war on terrorism. And Christina, thanks for letting me know. Um, that the United States was not just going to go after Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, the people responsible for 9/11. We were going to go after any extremist organization that we felt was going to be a terrorist threat to the United States. Which, on one hand, was very much kind of like a pep rally for the United States of like, yeah, we're gonna change things. But as we've previously talked about, wrapping up for today, what is potentially the difficulty about going to war against an idea or a concept? What potentially might be the challenge there? And saying we're not just going to go after Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, we're going to declare a war against terrorism. Or to put that question another way, how do you defeat an idea or a concept? Yeah, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. Because an idea is not a single target that you can, go out on a map and say, okay, we defeated the target. Um, terrorism is ultimately an idea. And if new organizations develop that are willing to use terrorism, then the conflict continues. And so as we come back next week, keep that in mind. That is going to be one of the challenges for the United States in its response to 9/11. Of when is the job done? When can you declare success in a war against terrorism? But we'll stop there for today. Don't forget about doing your family history project. That is due on Sunday. Um, as always, if you have any questions, stick around, let me know. Otherwise, you are good to go. Thanks for Samira. You too. See ya.